thought from Paul's writings in 1 Corinthians. Paul, the scripture's pretty significant, and Paul was writing this, of course. What was the power that ruled the world at that time, Paul's day? Rome, okay. So Paul was making a reference that all the Roman people would understand. And there's more in that text than you might expect. In the first part of the text, he's making reference to the Roman Colosseums, where there were games, there were gladiator fights, but at the end of the event at a Colosseum, the state would execute its political prisoners or generals maybe that had been captured in a war campaign or something like that. The people that the state thought was the most dangerous to the state, they would execute at the end of the games. So when Paul's saying, I think they saved us, the apostles, last, he's referring to that. He's referring to that. That's when the execution of criminals would be made. The next phrase, for we have been made a spectacle of the world both to angels and to men. When you think about that and you look at the Greek word that was for spectacle, which translated spectacle in the King James, that Greek word was theatron. So what English word do you think we get from theatron? Theater. That's right, theater. As you might have guessed, that's right, it's theater. So theatron might designate the building, or it might designate what's being acted out. And I think what Paul's referring to is what they were acting out, what men were observing by their lives. You'll find many references in Ellen White's writings to the thought that Christians are spectacles. One reference is from Acts of the Apostles, where she refers to the church as being the theater of his grace, in which he delights to reveal his power to transform hearts. Sometimes she refers to individual Christians as spectacles. She wrote in a letter to an individual in 1900, the inhabitants of unfallen worlds and of the heavenly universe are watching with intense interest the conflict between good and evil. They rejoice as Satan's subtleties are refuted with a what? Thus saith the Lord. It is written. As Christ met them. That's how Christ met Satan's temptations, right? When he was in the wilderness, Satan tempted him. Thus saith the Lord. Every victory that we gain through Christ's power is a gem in the crown of life. So anyway, God gave his people guidelines to follow, which, if followed, would show men in the universe that God's way is best. So what do we know those guidelines as? They're written, and Moses wrote them out in Exodus. Yeah, 10 Commandments, right? Okay, 10 Commandments. Now, Jesus was asked questions about the commandments. If you turn in your Bibles to Matthew chapter 22, you can read where he was approached by a lawyer. And the scribes and Pharisees were hoping to trip Jesus up. So they had a lawyer approach Jesus and ask him a question. And let's begin reading in Matthew 22 with verse 35. Then one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question, testing him, and saying, Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? Jesus said to him, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Now, earlier in Matthew, I think it's in Matthew chapter 17 or 19, verse 17. A similar question was asked Jesus by the rich young ruler. You remember the story of the rich young ruler? And in his reply to the rich young ruler, Jesus said, "You must keep the commandments." And that's very similar to what Paul recorded in Romans. Turn to Romans chapter 2. And notice what Paul wrote in verse 13 of Romans chapter 2. "For not the hearers of the law are just in the sight of God, but the doers of the law will be justified." So just hearing the law isn't enough. We must keep it, or we must do it. So going along with keeping the commandments, Ellen White urged believers to consider Isaiah chapter 58. And in manuscript 28 from 1900, she wrote, "I urge you to consider Isaiah 58, which opens a wide and extensive vineyard to be worked upon the lines which the Lord has pointed out. When this is done, there will be an increase of moral sources, and the church will no more remain almost stationary. There will be blessing and power attending their labor. The selfishness that has bound up their souls they have overcome, and now their light is being given to the world in clear, bright rays of living faith and a godly example. The Lord has His promises for all who do His requirements." Then in manuscript 36 from 1897, she wrote, "The whole chapter," speaking of Isaiah 58, "is applicable to those who are living in this period of Earth's history. Consider this chapter attentively, for it will be fulfilled." And I noticed that Sister White makes at least 15 references in her writings to Isaiah chapter 58. So let's turn to Isaiah chapter 58. Turn in your Bibles to Isaiah chapter 58. And in this chapter, part of the chapter anyway, God is telling His people, there's people who are kind of complaining and saying, you know, we're fasting, but we aren't seeing the blessings that we thought we'd be getting. So anyway, and God is saying, well, you've been giving me kind of like what we would say lip service. Saying one thing, but your actions show another. Notice what the prophet wrote in verses 5 to 8 of Isaiah chapter 58. The prophet writes, is it a fast I have chosen, a day for a man to afflict his soul? And is it to bow down his head like a bulrush and to spread out sackcloth and ashes? Would you call this a fast, an acceptable day to the Lord? Is this not the fast that I have chosen, to loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo heavy burdens, to let the oppressed go free, and that you break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, and that you bring to your house the poor who are cast out? When you see the naked, that you cover him, and not hide yourself from your own flesh? Then your light shall break forth like the morning. Your healing shall spring forth speedily, and your righteousness shall go before you. The glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. So, it sounds like this part of the chapter is speaking about what? Speaking about taking care of our fellow men, being an example. Love your neighbor as yourself. Sounds like that's part. That would be Christ, when He was talking to the lawyer, said the great commandment was what? To love God, all your heart. The second command. So this is addressing the second command, the second great commandment. Okay. Now, look at the last part, getting towards the last part of the chapter, in verse 13, starting with verse 13 and 14 of Isaiah 58. If you turn away your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy day of the Lord, honorable, and shall honor Him, not doing your own ways, nor finding your own pleasure, nor speaking your own words, then you shall delight yourself in the Lord. And I will cause you to ride on the high hills of the earth, and feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father. The mouth of the Lord has spoken. When the Lord speaks, does he mean it? He does mean it, yeah. That's why he put the emphasis. The mouth of the Lord has spoken. If you will honor me, the Sabbath commandment is the commandment where we show honor to God. It's the seal, as you were, of his people. And it is to be a testing truth in the last days in which we lead. But the fourth commandment was laid down long before the law was given to Moses, wasn't it? I mean, where was it found? It's in the early part of the Bible. Genesis chapter 2. That's right, Michael. Chapter 2, verse 3. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made. Now, did God need a break? Was he tired? No. God didn't need a break. He made the Sabbath for whom? For us. For us. Even in paradise, God saw that the Sabbath was essential for man. A time when he needed to lay aside what he did 6 days out of the week, his work, whatever it might be, so he could contemplate the Creator, contemplate the works of God, meditate upon his power and goodness. He needed a Sabbath to remind him more vividly of God. So, knowing the significance of the Sabbath, is it any wonder that Satan tried to make a substitute or a counterfeit Sabbath? No. When you think about it, you would really expect it, because Satan is jealous of God. What does Satan want? He wants worship. And the Sabbath is set up to remind us that we need to worship the Creator. So if Satan can't get worship directly, he figured he'd make up a counterfeit Sabbath. And that way, at least the people wouldn't be worshiping God on God's Sabbath. They'd be worshiping on another Sabbath. In a sense, in Satan's mind, they'd be worshiping him, following what he wanted people to do. And we're told that the Sabbath is going to be a testing truth. So as we go on, we could expect that perhaps there will be some consequences to keeping God's holy day, because the world won't like it. There are several instances in the Bible where we see that bad things happen to people who were worshiping God like they wanted. What's the first? The first instance in the Bible where a bad thing happens to a person who was worshiping God the right way. Cain and Abel. Right. Cain was offering sacrifices like God prescribed. Cain was doing it his own way. And Cain got upset that God was not accepting his sacrifice. And so what did he do? He killed Abel. He killed Abel. He removed the point of his irritation. He killed him. There's another instance, and this wasn't because of something that happened, but it was something that God's people wanted to happen. It was in Egypt. The children of Israel are still captive to Pharaoh. God had sent Moses to lead them out of captivity. But before that, God asked Moses to go to Pharaoh, and he said, I want you to go to Pharaoh, and I want you to request that my people be allowed to go out into the wilderness for 3 days to worship me. What did Pharaoh think of that idea? He didn't like it. He said, well, you guys are just lazy. He said, no, you can't go and worship God. And on top of that, the amount of bricks that you have to make, I'm increasing, and I'm not going to provide you any straw. So you can go out and get straw for yourself. So if you thought you could get your work done in 7 days, you'll need 8. But guess what? You don't have 8. So he persecuted the children of Israel because they wanted to go into the wilderness and worship God. There are some other stories in the Old Testament. Daniel. Daniel had his thing. He worshiped God. And he did it openly. The people plotting against Daniel knew like clockwork when Daniel would be out on his balcony praying. They plotted. They had a law made. And Daniel was thrown in the lion's den. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, same sort of situation. King built this altar in the plain. Everyone was to bow down to it. The 3 worthies did not bow down. And so they faced the penalty. And what was the penalty? Fiery furnace. Death. Just like Daniel's was a death sentence, so those 3 Hebrew boys were cast into that fiery furnace. Did God protect them? He surely did. In fact, Jesus was there with them, remember? King said, hey, did we throw 3 in? I see 4. And the 4th is what? Like the Son of God. And he was the Son of God. God protects. But does God always protect? Always? No. I mean, if God always protected His people trying to faithfully worship Him, we wouldn't have any what? Martyrs. That's right, there'd be no martyrs. But as we know, there's thousands of martyrs. People who faced up to persecution, to the laws of the land, and stayed true to God, even though they knew that they could be executed for it. So anyway, there was an article in our August 2022 review, Adventist review, that was entitled "The Christian's Call to Civil Disobedience." Now, I don't know if you read it or not, but that title just kind of grabbed me, and it was interesting. So I read it, and the article is very interesting. And so that's where I got the idea for this message, was from that article, reading that article. So the article reminds us that in the United States, do we have religious freedom, or are religious rights protected? Yes. Okay, yeah, most of you know. The First Amendment to the Constitution says, it has a clause in it. There's many clauses, but one of the clauses is called the Free Exercise Clause, which states, and I'm quoting, "Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." So that's the amendment that allows, so many different religions that we have in our country to worship without being persecuted by the government. However, this right is not absolute. And over the years, our courts have had a lot of different cases about this First Amendment right. And they've made different rulings. And they've kind of been redefining what it means to freely exercise a person's religion and what limitations of this right are. Are there limits to the right? They've all recognized so far that everyone has a right to hold religious beliefs. You can believe whatever you want. You have the right to hold your religious beliefs. But the right to practice your belief is not absolute. So, and some of that makes sense. For instance, you wouldn't think that your right to practice would be allowed if, for some reason in your religion, there was a rule that said, well, if you see somebody doing something that isn't consistent with your religion, you can go over and kill them. that's obviously not allowed. So that would be a restriction of rights if there was a religion that had a right like that. But in one of the latest cases that have been tried, the verdict or the decision was that as long as the federal government has a compelling government interest and the law is the least restrictive means of furthering the government's interest, it can place limits on an individual's ability to freely practice his or her religious beliefs. Okay. So the government is saying, as long as my interests, the government's interests, are not interfered with, you can practice your religion. What could that mean? What could that mean? Think about that. The concept of freedom of religion is well recognized. The world became aware of the benefit of this principle as World War II was going on and the world realized the horrible things that the Nazis had done, in particular to the Jews. But do you know that the Jews were not the only groups that the Nazis persecuted? How many, I brought it up with me, how many have you read the book 1,000 Shall Fall? It's a Review and Herald Publishing Association book. It is an amazing story of a family in Germany in World War II. The Hassel family, I believe was their last name. Anyway, Mr. Hassel was a call porter. And he got drafted into the German army when he was 40 years old. Okay? Kind of old to be drafted into the army, isn't it? Germany wanted everybody. Got drafted into the army when he was 40 years old. And they issued him a gun. And as it turns out, he was a great marksman. He was like one of the best in his company. He was a good marksman. He hit what he shot at. But as the war started and his basic training was over, he had to carry a gun. They issued him a gun, a pistol. He ended up being kind of a clerk, which was good for him. But they issued him a gun, a pistol. But one day he had a friend who was a woodworker making what looked like kind of a shelf bracket, something kind of like that. And he kind of got that from the man and he whittled it and he painted it black. He took out his revolver and he tossed it one night in a lake and put that black piece of wood in his holster. And he went through the whole war with that. If it had been discovered, he probably would have been executed. In fact, this man made his superiors so angry that one of his officers said, "Okay, I'm writing this in your record. When the war's over, you're going to be shot. But we're going to let you do your job good, so keep doing it. But when the war's over, we're going to shoot you because you are not supporting Hitler." And that was because he was trying to share his faith with some soldiers and he was overheard. And he said, "Hitler will not succeed." You didn't go around in Nazi Germany saying Hitler would not succeed and live to tell about it. Because Hitler had set himself up as God, basically. And I've got a book that I did some research in called Hitler's Cross. And Hitler, this is in the 1930s, was talking to a friend and he said, "I'm founding a new order. And in my order, the man God, that splendid being, will be the object of worship. Creation is not yet at end. Man is becoming God." So Hitler believed himself to be a god. And so Germany was sucked in. In fact, they made a one church. He said all these different denominations, no, there's going to be one church, the Reich Church. And everyone went to the Reich Church. And they replaced the Bible, took out all the Bibles. No, instead of the Bible's Mein Kampf, Hitler's book about his movement, was the new Bible. No more Bibles. No more crosses in the church. No Christian flags. The swastika. The Bible, and beside the pulpit, a sword. That was the order for the churches. And the worship was to Adolf Hitler. Wow. So, after the war was over, one of the people who had been locked up in a concentration camp because he tried to maintain his faith wrote, "First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionist, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me." Somber words, somber words. Anyway, what might surprise you during this time in Germany, Nazi party is in control, and one of the rules was that children must go to church on Saturday. That was one of the rules of the government schools. So guess what the president of the Hessian, which means German, Seventh-day Adventist Conference advised his members to do? He recommended to the church members that because of the dangerous political situation, they should send their children to school on Sabbath until the war was over. Quote, "God will understand our extreme circumstances." Did God understand the extreme circumstances of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Sure he did. Did he understand the extreme circumstances of Daniel? Sure he did. But they remained faithful. It's like the Potomac Conference saying, "Oh, don't worry about the Sabbath. God will understand if things get tough." Hard to believe, isn't it? So what does that tell us? What does that instance tell us? Are we responsible for what the General Conference or the Potomac Conference or any other conference believes and tells us? Is that our responsibility? What are we responsible for? What we do in our relationship with God. Anyway, but there was some scriptural foundation for following what the government told you to do. It's found in Romans chapter 3. Most of you probably know that. Romans chapter 3. I'm sorry, not 3, 13. Romans chapter 13, verses 1 and 2. Romans 13, verses 1 and 2. "Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God. And those who resist will bring judgment on themselves." That's interesting. Peter said something. Flip over to 1 Peter. 1 Peter chapter 2. And 1 Peter 2, beginning with verse 13. "Therefore submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme or to governors, as to those who are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of those who do God." So the governments have persecuted people, including Christians. Many have died in the arenas. So how do we reconcile the corrections to follow the government with what we believe to be basic rights of religious freedom. How can that be recognized or reconciled? Yeah, after World War II, the United Nations passed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights on December 10, 1948. Now, this declaration was not legally enforceable, but it led many governments around the world, especially the newer ones that formed after the war, to add in their constitutions or whatever something in their law where they would grant people a amount of religious freedom in order to fulfill, but in all of those laws, the different governments have different interpretations of what is mandated or what the government has to protect its interests. So in some countries, the government's interests are really onerous, and in other countries, not so much, kind of like ours is. But what has happened, and we're seeing this in different places over the world, is that in some places, religious speech is labeled as hate speech, and you can't do it. In some nations, they have school on Saturday, and you have to take exams on Saturday, and maybe you have to work on Saturday, on the Sabbath, honoring God's day, because it's not in the government's interest to give you the right to practice your religion the way you want to. Some governments forbid giving Bible studies. They don't want you to make any converts. I think some of the Arab countries are like that. And some countries demand that if you're in the service, you're going to bear arms and be ready to kill our enemies. You know, it's interesting, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it passed in the UN, and it's there, but all the communist countries did not vote for it, and a few others did not vote for it. So it's not universal. And as we know, religious freedom does not exist everywhere on our planet. As the courts continue to redefine our law regarding religious practice in particular, what do you think will happen? What does Ellen White say will happen? What does our prophet say? Is it going to get easier or harder for us to? It's going to get harder, isn't it, for us to? If the laws change, if it happens, when it happens, I should say, when it happens, the laws of the land restrict our freedom to worship God, to practice, we have to ask our questions, what will we do? What will we do? It doesn't matter what Potomac Conference might tell us we should be able to do. We have to answer for ourselves, what will we do? Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego faced national laws that did not offer them freedom to worship God as they wished. They decided to disobey those laws and were willing to face the penalty, death, for civil disobedience. In our early church history, it's interesting, Ellen White wrote this statement: when the laws of men conflict with the word and law of God, we are to obey the latter, the word of God, whatever the consequences may be. The law of our land requiring us to deliver a slave to his master, we are not to obey, and we must abide the consequences of violating the law. The law she was talking about was the Fugitive Slave Act that was passed in 1850, which was about 10, 11 years before the Civil War. Interesting, isn't it? Now, what's interesting also, a few weeks ago I get something called Business Insider, and it said that President Biden was meeting with historians that warned him about threats to democracy and compared the current moment with the pre-Civil War era. The Fugitive Slave Law, 1850, pre-Civil War. Interesting, isn't it? It said, President Biden, there are threats to democracy. Now, this meeting was, I think, came about probably because of the Capitol riots, that had happened and everything. They said, see, that's an example of our democracy is not safe, things can change. But we're in an interesting time of life. We don't know exactly how it's going to play out. But we know eventually what's going to happen, don't we? Because thank God we've got the Scriptures, we've got prophecy. Many years ago, you might not believe it, but I was a lifeguard and I taught swimming lessons. I was a water safety instructor certified by the Red Cross. And so on some summers, I worked at our Blue Ridge Youth Camp, and I taught kids how to swim and was a lifeguard and all that sort of thing. And anyway, so I was on the camp staff, and the assistant director of the camp was a little guy that came up to about here on me, and his name was Clayton Child. And Clayton was just like a ball of energy. He was just really an energetic guy. But Clayton, several times during the summer, would come up to me and he'd say, how's your courage, Dave? And I'd kind of, what on earth are you talking about? I don't even remember what I said, but I know the question I thought was just weird. I mean, how's my courage? It's great, it's fine. So I've thought about that. And I think what Clayton was really trying to ask me is, how's my courage about being a Christian, about being a Seventh-day Adventist? Are you embarrassed? When you're teaching your kids, are you showing them that you love God and you want to follow Him? Are you courageous enough to stand for God and to let people around you know that you stand for God? How's your courage? That's what he was getting at. So we have to ask ourselves, how is our courage? As we see things changing in our nation, as we see our religious rights to practice our religion being diminished, how is our courage? How is our courage? Are we anchored? The hymn, we have an anchor. Are we anchored? Are we ready to withstand the storm that we know is coming? How's your courage? When these things happen, what will we do? Will we have the courage to be or to practice civil disobedience and to say, no, I cannot worship when you are telling me I have to worship and in the way you're telling me I have to worship. I cannot do that. Regardless of the cost. We don't know what the cost will be, but we know it won't be pleasant. That much we know. Christ is our only hope. We have to be connected with Christ. We can't get the strength to stand in those days on our own. No way. No way. We need supernatural power. We need to stay, reinforce, do something each day to strengthen our connection with Christ so that when these things happen, if we're still alive on earth, we'll have the strength to practice civil disobedience.